everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Left Hook podcast. Today we're going to be having a discussion about the Vietnam War protests that emanated in the late 1960s and also how they relate to the current day protests against the Israeli war against the Palestinian people that we see being carried out in Gaza.
Yeah, and we're quite lucky to be joined by Jim Kane today, who is among other things, a illustrator, artist, a teacher, and spent a lot of time organising against the Vietnam War here in South Australia, Adelaide. And we thought we would sit down and pick his brain on his time and what he thought was important about those demonstrations, what they may have achieved or didn't achieve, and then comparing that to the current demonstrations taking place across universities around the world against the war on the Palestinian people. So,
welcome, Jim.
Welcome.
Hello.
Yes. I think like when any momentous historical events happen, it's important to wind the clock back.
Yep.
And that way it allows us to have a bit of context, and we can also learn from the past.
Yeah.
Reflect into the present and into the future. So, Jim, to get started, mate.
Yes.
When you look back at the Vietnam War protest movement, how did it start, in your opinion?
Well, I think you've got to put it into the political context of the time, and that was the Cold War. Right. Now, that really set up the stage. The anti-communism, the anti-Russian culture was prevalent.
Yeah.
The anti-communism, right? It was threatening to take over the world. The communists were infiltrating Australia, right? They were white-anting our social structures. They were dominating the union movement.
This is the 1950s Red Scare.
Yes,
Yep.
That's what you've got to put that in the context. Now, that really is very much the basis of it, because they kept up this anti-Russian, anti-communist rhetoric all the time, and it was so entrenched that eventually it split the ALP,
Yeah.
and we ended up with the DLP.
Do you think that your average everyday person with a bit of a political/historical education bought into the propaganda?
Yes.
Yes.
However, there were some voices, and they were coming from the ALP, namely Caldwell and Dr. Evatt. But they were ridiculed, put down by the media, and Menzies was facing a defeat in the coming elections. How did he get back in? He beat the old communist cannon, they used to say, and announced that there was a nest of spies in Australia. After the election, names will be named. Of course, no one was. It didn't happen at all. So it was the beat-up scare all the time. It was relentless.
Yeah.
So when the Vietnam War came along, it was very easy to slot that into that culture.
Yeah.
So getting back to those earlier times, when we first heard about conscription, at that stage I was a student and lived in a little student bubble, haven't got one idea about any politics at all.
And
right?
When you say student, this was at the South Australian
Yes, the students at the art school.
At the art school
yes.
here in Adelaide, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately.
Probably not.
Right.
However,
Yeah.
conscription is announced.
Yeah.
And I was told, look, you could get sent to Vietnam, whether you wanted or not. And my friends also, my age group, a year younger and all that, we were confronted with the same proposition. Now, the first thing is, we'd never heard of Vietnam. Didn't know. Where is it? So I go to our family atlas, which we got from our grandparents, looked up Vietnam, wasn't in the atlas. The atlas doesn't lie.
Yeah, of course.
No Vietnam.
Yeah.
However, a little bit later I found that, yes, it was in the atlas, but it was called French Indochina.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And then we had to update that to Vietnam. Now, once the conscription got going, the propaganda stepped up. The Liberal Party put out a famous pamphlet which had a map in it of Vietnam at the top, Australia at the bottom, a whole lot of little red arrows coming down from Vietnam to Adelaide.
I think I've seen this photo.
Have you seen the little red arrows?
I think I've seen the artwork, and it says, "Communism, where will you draw the line?" And it has all these red arrows coming down from Asia, and what was obviously China at the time.
Right. And if you put up any argument or discussion that challenged that, you were told, right, what do you want? Do you want them to end up on our doorstep?
Yeah.
They'll be sleeping with your daughter before you know it. Absolutely.
We will stop them before they get here.
Yeah.
And that was the fear they kept up.
So they used that ideology of anti-communism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's what got it all going.
Okay.
I think it's important to note as well that that entire line of argument has since been debunked, as the Vietnamese did win the Vietnam War, and they did not spread communism down to Adelaide, South Australia. They didn't make it that far.
It's a very important point to make. Yes.
Continue though, Jim.
Yes.
Sorry, go on.
Well, so following on from that, the first protest, or so we say, stand against the war, did come from some of the students at Adelaide Uni. It was only about 3 and 4 had a meeting at Adelaide Uni.
Yeah. Was this so? This was specifically in response to the announcement of conscription.
It was in response to the Vietnam War. That meeting that was held at Adelaide Uni then was immediately after we had conscription. Vietnam just got into the headlines. Now there's about 3 students at Adelaide Uni pulled a meeting on the Vietnam War. Cut a long story short, big discussion. The university students unanimously came out and supported the war then.
Yeah.
Right? Then we suddenly realised, those students, where did we look? Now, there had been previous anti-war protests going back into the 50s, coming from the C&D group, which is an English group, which was the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
Yeah.
They had done a few little protests. But once the Vietnam War was on the happening, right, and was about half a dozen of us eventually got together, but the only support we got came from the older generation then, who were the anti-bomb protesters, the ban the bomb movement.
And did that come out of the Korean War, possibly? Or was it just sort of coming out of the 1950s? There's a lot of scare about nuclear war, bombs.
Yeah, I think the Korean War was part of that.
Yeah, of course.
Okay? So there in this stage, there was virtually no organised opposition, nothing. And we got together, about half a dozen of us, and decided we were the Committee for Vietnam Protest. 6 of us sitting in Adelaide.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the next step in the whole thing, how in the hell are we going to get any support or organise?
Yeah.
So that became a crucial thing. So we would try to organise demonstrations and meetings. But then trying to do that, what we found, every attempt we made to try and communicate with people to get support was blocked. And we were told, write a letter to the paper. We wrote letters to the paper. Guess what? They didn't publish them, right? The other thing we were told was to... Hang on, sorry.
That's okay.
Where do I get that? Oh, yeah.
Was this by, for example, university administration that was saying this to you?
No. You got it from all different levels that we were being told. The other thing we tried to do was to do posters. Now, we ended up printing them with silkscreen printing in our kitchen. But then we found there's nowhere you could put posters. Everywhere, no posters. You're not allowed to put them on telegraph poles. You can't put them on bridges. You weren't allowed to put them anywhere.
Yeah.
So eventually a couple of us, one night we went out and we stuck posters on the footpath. Then got arrested for that because you're not allowed to stick posters on the footpath.
So you specifically got arrested for putting
Yes,
a post.
I've got a charge of vandalism for sticking a poster on the footpath. But that's how tight it was.
What did the post? Do you remember what the posters were saying?
Oh, I think at that stage we were trying to promote a demonstration.
Okay. Yep.
Right, so we couldn't do that. Another one of our members was trying to hand out pamphlets we managed to make.
Yep.
Not allowed to do that, got arrested for handing out
Pamphlets as well?
Oh, yes.
Was this on the university campus or just anywhere?
No, this was in the streets.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that was the latest. Oh, yeah, the other one was told, go round to Speaker's Corner. I never heard of Speaker's Corner then. We found out, yes, there was what they called a Speaker's Corner. It was behind the zoo.
Yes.
Right?
Which is a real public,
Yeah.
thoroughfare.
Yes.
Lots of people go through
Yeah.
heaps of foot traffic, lots of exposure,
Yeah.
obviously. Yeah.
However, that was the first part of the struggle, was trying to accumulate some support.
Yep.
Anytime we had a demonstration, if we got any support there, you'd take everyone's name and address. We built up what we then was mailing lists.
Of course.
That was the clue. No social media or anything like that,
Yeah.
right? You couldn't get anything on the radio and the press anywhere. Okay, you're virtually gagged.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of networking, word of mouth, and then always we get people to a demonstration, you got their names and address.
Yeah.
So we got that all rolling, get organised, get a demonstration going. What happens? Police step in, council, etc. Right, you're not allowed to walk on the road, you have to walk on the footpath, you have to go in single file, right, you've got to stop at the lights. So effectively they were trying to destroy the demonstration.
Without having to use
Yeah.
any real force or any real...
Exactly. And what sort of came of that? That a lot of our energy went into fighting for the right to demonstrate.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Now, that really was quite a messy issue,
Of course.
right?
Yeah.
Because on one hand, we were told we were fighting communism. Communism suppresses free expression,
Yeah.
right? You'll get locked up if you criticise the government,
Yeah.
and that's what we're fighting.
Fighting authoritarianism.
Yes,
of
and
course.
meanwhile in Adelaide, everything was done to suppress free expression.
Yeah.
And
that-
yeah,
I was going to say that ties into, I believe, recently in South Australia, there's been talks about, you might know this better than myself, about protest laws and changes to protest laws.
Yeah, so specifically in South Australia here, they have increased the fines. Actually, I think I was just reading this previously. They've increased the maximum fine for demonstrations up to $50,000 from $750. So up to $50,000 and up to 3 months imprisonment. And it's specifically targeting people that try and disrupt traffic. And I guess...
So I guess that's more just a heavier-handed version of what they were doing back then.
That's exactly right. Correct. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that was directed very much at the extinction.
Extinction
Rebellion, yes.
Extinction Rebellion. And it was because someone abseiled from the Morphett
Yes.
Road Bridge
But,
here in Adelaide.
yeah, that's another issue because their strategy was deliberately to
disrupt.
disrupt.
Correct. Yes.
Now we never had that.
You weren't doing that. You weren't abseiling from bridges.
No,
you
no.
just wanted to...
We'd march on the road.
Correct. Yep.
And what happened eventually, we did win that argument simply because in the longer term with the Vietnam demonstrations, the numbers got up.
Yep.
And further down the track, you could get a couple of hundred people coming to demonstrate. And you just look at the cops and say, all right, we're going on the road. You want to arrest us all? Go ahead.
So there becomes that point where there's enough critical mass
Yes.
of public support.
That was what it was. And what the police didn't like actually doing was arresting a lot of people because it just created more work for them. They had to, we all had to be processed. When you got arrested, you had to be processed. They marched you down to Angus Street, took your fingerprints, had to photograph you, take all those details.
It's the old paperwork dilemma, isn't it?
But anyway, that's a bit of an aside.
Can I ask as well?
A couple of things on this point.
What kind of who else? What kind of people were joining the protests? Was it mainly people from the university, or did you have did the trade unions start getting involved? Were there any political figures that?
At the early stages, it was individual students rolled up, right? But we didn't get the masses of the students in the early stages, right? And as far as the politicians went, the Labor Party were very reluctant to come out. In theory, they opposed conscription, they opposed the war, right? But they were pretty well, how do I explain it? They're all a bit shell-shocked after going through all the anti-communism.
Yes.
They've been destroyed by the split with the DLP. So there only were a few individuals.
They wanted to keep you guys at arm's length, essentially.
Yeah. And just to mention a few names, that's right, one was Senator Kavanagh, which is probably forgotten, and of course Arthur Corwell stood up against and Dr. Abbott and those people. But no, that ALP was very quiet. But we did get, as I said, a few politicians, a few ALP members, and a couple of unionists. That's all. It was fragmentary.
Just for context, for people who are listening, the ALP is the Australian Labor Party, and that's kind of our social democratic party, so our left of centre party, sort of like the Democrats in America. Not quite.
Slightly less right-wing.
Yeah, a lot less right-wing. Anyway, and obviously very similar to the Labor Party in Britain. Obviously, the Australian Labor Party comes kind of directly out of the Labor movement in Britain. And, just sort of for context, I'd add that. Can I just add one thing as well? Because obviously you're talking about demonstrating for the right to demonstrate and for freedom of speech, is that here in Australia, we don't have a Bill of Rights. Like, for example, in America and other Western liberal democracies do actually have something enshrined in their constitution that protects freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom for political organisation. And while in Australia's constitution we do have those things laid out, there's a lot of grey areas. It's not like the Bill of Rights in America. And we definitely don't have that kind of political culture where we stand up and fight for freedom of speech. And it's kind of, because it's not part of our political culture, when it comes to the laws around it, they are a lot more loosely interpreted.
A lot murkier.
A lot murkier. So the police could round up people that were trying to express themselves in whatever manner and basically find them and suppress those and get away with it, because we just do not have those entrenched constitutional rights that America has and other liberal democracies.
Yes, we were aware of that. That was something we had to sort of get a bit of understanding about. That was the problem. But now the other thing that was going on was the role of the police in ASIO. Now, the police initially were very hostile to us. Now, what I've learnt since then, why were they hostile? Because the police that were assigned to deal with demonstrators came from what was the old vice squad, right? And vice squads in police organisations around the world are notoriously corrupt. The other hostility, but was infiltration and surveillance by ASIO. All right. Now, ASIO, in retrospect, we know this because some people got their freedom of information stuff and found out, yes, ASIO was infiltrating the movement. They were putting listening devices in people's houses and tapping our telephone. Right?
Do you think you ever had a listening device placed in your house?
I've never checked it out, but
you wouldn't know though.
Look, I won't go into it now. There's ways we found that out.
Yeah.
And at that time, I remember talking to one of the members of the Communist Party then, because they were the evil force. Communist Party, oh God. And they did come out and support us. And I got to know some of them. And I remember talking to one of the kind of officials from the party and saying, what's your membership here? He said, about 50. What? And they put the Menzies back in power. And then he said, they're not all active. He said, half of them are ASIO agents. I said, why don't you kick them out? He said, we couldn't afford to. We need their dues.
That's so
That's
good.
funny.
And I'll just add quickly that ASIO is basically our equivalent of the FBI. It's basically that's basically what it's the equivalent of. It's the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, but I'm pretty sure they act on domestic intelligence issues mostly. So they're not obviously like the CIA, which acts abroad.
Which supposedly isn't allowed to act domestically.
Yeah. But I was just going to say there's definitely that correlation there between what ASIO was doing here in Australia and what they were doing, what the CIA and the FBI were doing also in America as well, against, for example, the Black Panthers and other radical movements that were against the Vietnam War.
Did you also find, were there counter-protesters at all? Did you have reactionary mobs, rocking up to counter your demonstration?
What we did have eventually with the conscripts who were up in the hills at the place in the hills, what's it called?
Oh, yeah.
Where they were trained. I've forgotten the name of the place. Anyway,
I think it's up at Woodside.
Woodside.
Yeah, that's where it was.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, they were at Woodside. Now, a couple of times, groups of them did come down, and we could always pick them out. They wore check shirts.
Do you think this was voluntary, or do you think they were given some orders to
I don't think they were given orders to do anything. I think this was on their own decision, right? And a couple of times they just came down and they stood in the crowds and yelled abuse at us.
Yeah.
That's the nearest we got to that sort of... And there were odd incidents when I heard
Was there ever violence or...
Not that I know regarding any pushback against us. But there were individual things would happen. Like I was going down the street in the city one day and I had my moratorium badge on. I was confronted by one of the conscripts and he ripped it off me. All right, that's the closest it got.
Your moratorium badge? What was the moratorium?
Oh, hang on, that comes later. What I want to do with next.
Yeah, no,
I was just trying to give a bit of a sketch at the beginning. Okay, and I did mention then, remember, university students wouldn't support us. But then it swung around. What changed the whole protest movement was when the university students came in on it. Now, the reason they were coming in on it, their starting point wasn't anti-war. Their starting point was an international movement of university students demanding student participation in courses, right? And it was a movement wanting a democracy for the students, So they had two organisations, SDA, Students for Democratic Action, SDS. Now they put their strength into the anti-Vietnam, anti-conscription movement. Then it got big. And our little committee for Vietnam protests, thank God, became irrelevant because the students moved in en masse. And that swung the whole tone of the movement. Because then what propped up in the universities was a whole spectrum of groups, right? They're all at war with each other.
All united by this common goal,
but
would you say?
Yes. We could all go on demonstrations together, right, and then argue the point later. But the important thing about the student movement then, it was international, and I can remember eventually seeing on television the protest in Paris, France. And the most amazing ones we saw were in Japan, right? Thousands of Japanese students out there.
Wow.
Confronting thousands of police. But the way they did it, they marched in columns. They called them dragons.
Very orderly.
Orderly.
Yes.
And the police were orderly. They'd all line up, face each other. But what used to knock us out was the Japanese students start hurling Molotov cocktails at the police.
Oh, wow. Oh,
God.
And that was the first stage. They throw the mollies at the police, and when they got around, then they all banged together. But anyway, this was very significant because then we've got the pictures of the demonstrations in America, and I mentioned France, Italy, Germany, very big, right? And that really swung the whole tone, particularly the international student movement really was the significant change in the whole thing.
Well, because then the media couldn't choose to ignore you. Well, you
That's
said
right.
you said previously that it was difficult to get any attention. You'd write letters to the newspaper and be ignored. But once you have a international movement like that, and the media starts to pay attention, it starts to gain traction.
They have to at least acknowledge its existence.
That's right.
They obviously can still misrepresent the objective and misrepresent the goals of the people there,
Yep.
but obviously they still have to acknowledge that it happened. So Jim, you were saying the protest really took off when the moratorium came in,
Yes.
and that was introduced into the spectrum. What can you explain what that was to all our younger viewers?
I think in retrospect, what really happened was that what were referred to as the moratoriums came right near the end of the 60s. Right? And they followed on from all the work being done by our little Committee for Vietnam Protest and the student movement. Now, what we realised then that the student movement really didn't have enough muscle. And then it looked like the anti-Vietnam movements had really got legs, because what was happening also, a lot of the anti-Vietnam literature we were getting was coming from the American publication Newsweek. And a lot of people were reading that, and that's when it kind of broke the mould of being an isolated group. And people were getting more information on what was going on in the war. The pictures of the atrocities were being seen around the place. And that changed the tone a lot, because before then we were described as being,
Hippies and...
Well, it wasn't so much we were being called hippies, but we were Russian agents. And we were in the pay of Russia. There's all sorts of stupid...
I've always suspected that about you, Jim.
Yes.
I've heard you speaking Russian in the back room before.
Yeah.
Exactly. So anyway, what happens at that point is that, yes, it looked like it would be a good career move to support the anti-Vietnam movement, right? Now, the moratoriums were formed by, well, I should say, the professional class just about. And that included, we had academics in it, and clergymen, and a couple of politicians. They dominated it. And that's when they launched the really big demonstrations.
Yeah.
Right? We had those big conflicts with the
These
police.
are the ones that we see historically when we think of...
See, what was going
these
on
protests.
then, the moratoriums were developing and changing. Police didn't figure it out, what was going on. And a lot of the conflict came because they really bungled it, because they had no experience of dealing with a large crowd like that. And the turning point really was the moratorium set the stage for the Whitlam government.
Yes.
Right. And of course, when the Whitlam government came in, ended conscription. Vietnam War was lost.
Over for Australia. Absolutely.
Right.
And that was obviously, that political reality was only allowed due to, again, this mass turnout and the growth of the protests.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was a slow growth, starting off, as I said, with half a dozen of us. And then we got the moratoriums. We had thousands on the streets.
Yes.
So just a personal question while we're at this point. Obviously, it went for such a long period of time.
Yes.
What motivated you to begin with, but what kept you going the entire time? Because it sounds like this went on for years and years and years.
It did.
So what kept you going out there and doing it? Did you ever feel just defeated?
It wasn't a matter of feeling defeated. It became a kind of just about a conditioned reflex.
Yeah.
You had to get on with your life. You had to go back and be a student and study. You had to go and get jobs.
Yeah.
And the war was there. And a part of that was with the anti-conscription movement. Because what they did then, if you failed to comply with the registration requirements and you weren't going to have anything to do with it, you were then a draft dodger. Draft dodgers were liable to arrest in 18 months jail it was.
Were you ever conscripted?
No,
No.
I was actually 1 year too old.
Ah.
My friends weren't though.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was the point. But the thing about that conscription then was that they brought in all this legislation, like you could be jailed for harbouring a draft dodger. You could be jailed and often fined for employing a draft dodger.
Yeah.
So we were living in shared households. So heaps of us had draft dodgers there. The whole household was liable to arrest. Right?
Yeah.
And that continually created a kind of tension that you live with. You had friends that were draft dodgers,
Yeah.
you know, and that's the way it went.
You'd have a lot of anxiety from that.
Not me personally.
Yeah. But I'm saying if you were harbouring draft dodgers.
Well, one of the things about that the way it worked is that our police here couldn't arrest draft dodgers. It was a Commonwealth offence. Only the Commonwealth police could. So we could have demonstrations and we could have draft dodgers come along and speak.
Proudly announcing that
Yes.
they're draft dodgers, yes.
And the police couldn't touch them.
So would it have to have been...
And it had to be the Commonwealth police.
Would they be the equivalent to the AFP today, to the federal police?
No, my understanding they're quite different.
Ah.
In other words, they were totally incompetent because it was work they'd never done before. They spent most of the time guarding buildings in Canberra,
Yeah.
right? And then they had to do this, and as I said, they were real bunglers.
So just not competent at all.
No.
So the Commonwealth Police were basically the equivalent of the federal police during that period.
Oh,
So they operated in Australia between 1917 and 79.
What you got?
Yeah, I just looked this up. So they were in fact the federal police, the Commonwealth Police. Yeah.
Were
The
they?
equivalent.
The equivalent. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. For a draft dodger to be arrested, it had to be someone from the federal police force.
Yes.
That would have created a very interesting dynamic,
It would
I
have.
can imagine, at the
Yes.
protest, especially given the fact that the local police didn't have the power to do anything, shall we say, in that instance. It does sound funny.
That is. Yeah.
That is hilarious. So the objective, do you think the objective changed? So your initial objective, which was protesting the war and protesting the conscription,
Yes.
do you find that overall objective, as the protests grew and you had more and more kind of groups that all came together under what was supposedly a unified goal, did you find the objective maybe from the people that were leading the groups, did you find that their objective might have been something that was different to yours originally?
Yes.
Yeah.
Look, what was going on with the student movement, which is a big topic in itself, was the political factions developed amongst the students, right? And in those demonstrations, not everyone had the same agenda, right? There was what we want to call a radical faction who were straight out provocateurs, because what they wanted was conflict with the police, because their theory was, we've got to radicalise these students. How do you radicalise the students? You're no good telling them they're living in a fascist state, right? What you've got to do is get the police to hit them on the head. Then they believe you. So there was a faction that deliberately wanted that conflict, right, as they saw it as a process of radicalisation. However, they were outnumbered by the other groups who really wanted no violence with the police. There was a very strong anti-violent pacifist movement there, and there was a real faction of people who were interested in non-violence from Gandhi. That was part of it also. And often when we did have conflicts with the police, it was very non-violent, right? So at one time I was involved in a sit-in it was in the Victoria Square. The Americans didn't have an embassy there. They had like some diplomatic office there. We went and did a sit-in there, right? and wouldn't go when they were closing down. So we're staying until you stop the war.
Oh, yeah. How did that turn out?
Oh, the police came in.
Yeah.
And that was quite, in retrospect, was amusing because they didn't know what to do because they'd never done this before.
Yeah.
Right? A couple of uniformed officers came in and said, you've got to get out. And we said, we're not. Then they wandered off. Next thing, a police officer comes in, higher rank, and has a talk with us. No, we're not going. So then they had to drag us out.
Yeah.
Right. Now, my point being is that there was that confusion. The police and ASIO and all the rest of the services, they really couldn't figure it out. ASIO had a real disaster when one of the student protesters came out and said, well, I was put in here by ASIO to spy, but I changed my mind. I'm joining the movement.
Wow.
That's how incompetent they got.
Yeah.
So,
However, but people were spied upon and tracked, and there was all that going on. Now, I think they did it because they had nothing else to do. So we had this big institution, like ASIO was established very much during World War II to stand out the Nazis. They ran out of Nazis. They still had an institution which kept reproducing itself and had to find some threat to Australian security.
Just to justify the existence
Yes.
of such
a
an
bunch of uni students demonstrating slaughter in Vietnam. That was our internal threat.
Yes, and I think in some ways it hasn't changed much.
No.
It was all that paranoia.
And how did the media cover the protests actually? Were they and as well, did their perception of you change from the beginning to the end? When you had a mass mobilisation of people, did they suddenly jump on side?
Look, the media, now quickly, the ABC wouldn't touch it. We did put out press releases. ABC wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't give us any publicity, anything. Because you've got to go back to the ABC then. The ABC are government controlled. The Liberal Party have been in power for years. They stacked the ABC. It was much later the ABC did change a bit, okay? But there was a deliberate strategy to try and hype the media, because what we suddenly figured out, there's no good going around and being well behaved and talking to people. They ignore you. You've got nothing on Channel 7 or Channel 9. But if we had a scuffle with the police, then they'd put it on. And it was always denigrating the students. They would take the demonstrators turned violent. They still use that.
Of course.
Right? And then we have this little push and shove with the cops. Now, that was the clue that somehow we had to create events that would get into that media.
To draw their attention.
Yeah, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Because what we suddenly learnt, there's lots of, was at that stage when we were getting scuffles with the police and getting arrested, lots of people were watching that on television here, and they're watching us, some of the long-haired people, getting dragged off. Then they go and watch the latest rock and roll. They all got long hair. And it was very much a kind of hippie cultural thing that was an element in that.
Absolutely.
Is that a lot of people identified with the demonstrators getting dragged away by the police. So then the next stage in that was setting up events that were deliberately intended to get into the media. Like we had one group at Flinders University there who came out of the drama department actually.
That sounds
and they
fitting.
threatened to burn a dog alive in Victoria Square. They're going to napalm a dog in Victoria Square. That got on the front page of the news. Look what the dreadful demonstrators are doing. It was all a bluff. There was no dog.
Oh, wow.
No napalm, no dog.
No, yes. But that became the strategy,
Of course.
creating events like that. And then we eventually got to a stage where we did a big demonstration, east end of Rundle Street, where we built this Vietnamese village.
Did you napalm it?
Wait a minute.
Oh, no.
We built this Vietnamese village and had it on a sort of wooden table there. We made it all out of cardboard and that. And we were going to set fire to it. So we stuffed it full of rag and kerosene. I remember doing it and thinking, we need more kerosene. Yeah, pour more in. We've never done it before. You put more in. Right. Come the demonstration in Eastern Rundle Street. We had the old rock band there, Red Angel Panic, up on a balcony playing Come On Baby Light My Fire. We light it. Bang, it went up. A wall of flame. It burnt through the table. It collapsed onto the road and set fire to the road. Then the cops gave up. They called in the fire brigade. Right? And we still had Red Angel Panic. The police came and turned off the power to shut up the band. The police just lost control. They got lost in the crowd. They're running around with us. Really strange.
But that obviously would have drawn the attention of the media back
Well,
at an earlier point.
Well, that's another issue because it did get sort of stamped out. It didn't quite work in that respect we
Yes.
were hoping for. But the event itself went beyond our wildest imagination. But later on, the cops did arrest two demonstrators really, and charged them with setting fire to the road. You're not allowed to set fire to the road.
You're not allowed to put posters on the roads.
Not-
You can't set
you're
fire
not
to the
allowed to set
roads.
fire to the road.
All you can do is drive on the road.
So that was one example. Lots of demonstrations that developed like that. When you look at the end of we're getting up to the 70s, 69, 70, we look at those demonstrations that took that character as opposed to the very early ones when you had to walk along the footpath in a single file.
Yep.
And would you say overall the demonstrations and the protests achieved their objective? When
No,
you look at the overall...
I think this is a very important question. Were the demonstrations in America and Australia effective in stopping the war, slowing it down? They weren't. The demonstrations were going on in America for months, but every week they were losing an average of 90 guys were getting killed in Vietnam every week.
Yes.
But they kept the war going.
Yes.
And I don't think the demonstrations really had a lot of influence in a way.
But do you think that, again, they laid the groundwork for the politicians? For example, a Gough Whitlam-like character, would he ever have been able to come into power and draw us out of the war had you not had the protest movement?
I think that's part of the case. The real influence on the demonstrations was internally on the political landscape then.
Of course. So maybe not a bit more indirect, not necessarily a complete...
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the influence of it. But the influence of it was on a lot of people did get kind of radicalised a bit through the demonstrations. And what I mean by that, they started to take an interest in Southeast Asia. The thing that came out of that on the Vietnam War, there was suddenly a lot of interest in the history of Vietnam.
Of course.
Right? And we had study groups. In the very early stage, we had study groups. And we went out and looked up everything we could on Vietnam and got a background in the history. Now, the use of those Vietnam demonstrations, I think, it did open people's minds to a broader look at the whole geopolitical scene, which hadn't happened before here.
And I think probably even a moderately nuanced perspective and view and study of the history of that region, any sane person would look at that and then look at the way the war was being carried out and would not be able to justify it, would not be able to justify what was being done to the people in that region.
And just... obviously, you get caught up in the moment and I guess you're out there demonstrating and it feels like something's happening, something's being achieved. Obviously, the demonstrations are getting larger. The media is paying attention. Politicians might be addressing the demonstrations. did you feel like you were making a difference at the time? Because in hindsight, you're saying obviously it probably didn't in a lot of ways. It may have
indirectly
obviously influenced some of the politics. But did it feel like things were changing and moving?
Yes, because our numbers were increasing. Being part of the original group and seeing how it developed, and then we could see that it had legs. It was out of control. They weren't going to stop it, particularly with the moratoriums. Yep. When you've probably seen some of that newsreel, and there were thousands of people, right, having that big riot with the police on the corner. It was on King William Street and North Terrace, wasn't it? Right, now that was the culmination, and we could see the difference the way it developed till we were irrelevant and marginalised. But that's what we wanted.
Yeah.
In many ways, we achieved our objectives. But as soon as Whitlam got in, bang, whole movement collapsed. A lot of those political groups all withered away. The student movement withered away as well. And we've got a new era coming in.
So obviously you mentioned the new era. And at the end of the Vietnam War, I guess the next big conflict that drawed out mass demonstrations was the Iraq War. I do have some memories of a kid attending one of those demonstrations here in Adelaide. I was very young. And then obviously that was probably the biggest mass demonstration movement globally.
I think so.
Was the Iraq War.
Yes.
And then I guess the next one after that is what we're seeing today with the demonstrations of all sorts, not just uni students, but specifically uni students at the moment, against the war being carried out against the Palestinian people in Gaza at the moment. So how do you compare your experience demonstrating against the Vietnam War compared to what's happening now? Where are the similarities and the differences, do you think?
I think the one that strikes me the most, first of all, is the difference, right? It took us 10 years, starting with half a dozen of us, really. 10 years later, we had a few thousand on the streets, right? Now, with Iraq's interesting. What happened with Iraq? One big demonstration, full stop, the end.
Yep.
Now, I don't understand how it went like that, but it did. But again, now with the Palestinian ones, first demonstration in Adelaide, we had, they reckon, 4,000.
Correct.
Right? It started off big, and it's still going.
Yeah.
And it's growing.
In Melbourne, they said there was tens of thousands, potentially one of the biggest anti-war demonstrations in Australia's history. And I would just say that I personally was there during those first few demonstrations, and it was quite incredible. There was a lot of people, and people from all walks of life as well. It wasn't per se a student demonstration like what you've been describing. It's kind of a demonstration by a broad range of society.
Yes,
I think
exactly.
that was a very interesting thing as well. There were people, obviously people possibly of Palestinian descent, Middle Eastern descent. There were families, there were young people, old people, I think, like you said, people from all different walks of life to which them this is an issue.
And I think another thing I did notice with the Palestinian ones was the role of the police. They were running around, and one had a little jacket called Police Liaison Officer. They were directing the demonstration.
They were.
Right? And it was a whole different relationship with the police then, because they knew they had no hope of doing anything about it. The best thing they could do is try and facilitate it so that the traffic could flow around the demonstration.
Absolutely. Well, they closed off one side of North Terrace.
Yes.
They closed off King
And
William
what
Road.
the police really did was, in effect, support the demonstration. There was, and also I noticed a lot of people were quite friendly with the police there.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have dreamt of that. Collaborating with the enemy, no way.
Yeah,
of course.
But anyway, that was another feature of it, was that whole way the police did handle it. And a couple of times in them I got moved on, or got told to move. They were quite polite. They've obviously done some homework and they've been briefed.
I imagine the training's changed since then. As you mentioned, that those initial demonstrations during the Vietnam War, they were the first of their kind.
Yes.
So there's...
Exactly, and I did mention that the police they used, because they equated it with what was the old bodgy and widgy problem they had, and the anti-larrikin squad, and they were what they saw as being socially disruptive. These people, they had to get them off the streets, and that's what the anti-larrikin squad did.
Yep.
Go around and they gave them a bit of a belt and told them to go home. However, the police anyway. The police response had fundamentally changed.
Yeah. And I guess what would you have to say to the mass student demonstrations that are taking place, especially in America, and they're starting to be replicated across the globe in Europe and here in Australia now, specifically the encampment styles, where they're trying to replica the tent cities that have been erected now in Gaza, where the refugees or the people that have had their homes destroyed have had to flee into other towns and cities and erect tents. So they're doing that. But what I just guess from a glance, from seeing those videos now of those big demonstrations in America, what would you... Yeah, what really comes to mind, and do you think their strategy is effective in some way, or?
Yes, look, what I suppose, might even say I'm concerned with the student demonstrations. They have an ability to fizzle out, right? That student commitment, right, will last a certain amount of time. Now, if they don't forge links with external organisations outside of the university, they could wither away. Now, the lesson, again, from Vietnam is the moratoriums happened because there was links forged outside of the student movement with the church, with some political parties, etc. Right? Now, at the moment, that's all student, and that's the problem. Come university holidays, come their exams, the student movements are notorious for fizzling out, and that's I think that's what's going on in America at the moment, particularly with the Democrats and a lot of the Republicans. We'll just sit tight.
And we'll let it burn itself
Let
out.
it burn exactly. Let it burn itself out. It has the potential to do that unless, right, they can forge a broader front.
Yeah.
It is interesting what you said. You notice a difference in policing and the police reaction from when you guys were protesting, obviously, as opposed to now. That does not seem to be the case in the United States. I think the police in Australia have been a lot more accommodating, whereas in the United States we've seen some pretty brutal police crackdowns, obviously your tear gas, and we've also seen a lot of counter-protesters, kind of more reactionary figures that are coming in either sabotaging protests or kind of violently harassing said protesters as well.
I was just going to say, it goes without saying, though, that the police force in America are just an entire different organisation to pretty much any other police force in the world, and specifically here in Australia.
Absolutely.
They act as counter-terror squads, and they use...
Or terror squads, depending on your perspective.
That's right. But they use significant force.
Absolutely.
They're not afraid to belt people around, throw tear gas at them, use rubber bullets.
And lots of their state police forces have also been trained by the IDF, which is an interesting thing to note.
That is.
So if we ever see some similarities in tactics.
And what I've noticed about the pushback in America against the demonstrators, I'm hearing the same speeches I heard against the Vietnam demonstrators. Politicians getting up and saying, I support the right to protest, but not if protesters are vandalising it and damaging property.
Yep.
And we've got to stamp that out.
It's probably interesting as well, because I imagine lots of those same politicians, they might have 2 or 3 years ago been saying we support the right of demonstrators in Hong Kong to violently protest against the authoritarian regime.
Yes.
And then at the same time,
we can-
they can flip the switch.
We can get onto that one.
Yeah.
Yes, and they can flip the switch and say, but, this... whatever rhetoric these people are using, we will not allow this as it threatens X and X and X.
That's right. And you can have 1,000 demonstrators on the street. One person puts a rock through a window. Again, demonstrators turn violent. We support their right to protest, but not to damage property.
Property, yes.
Yeah.
Private property.
And they're coming up with all the same stuff. And when you look at it, like in America, for example, it's about 50 universities. I saw a list of them or
It's
more.
very impressive. It's very it's quite inspiring as well.
And then you get these reports, and again, this is a parallel to Vietnam, where we're told where Jewish students are being threatened on campus. Then I see another video of it where Jewish students are organising the demonstrations,
Yes.
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
But we don't mention that.
No, of course not.
And there's definitely those parallels and similarities where you described kind of having the context of the anti-communist ideology, the Red Scare,
Yes.
and how that kind of ideology now of anti-Semitism is being used to denigrate the protesters. Where if you listen to what the protesters are saying, and if you've been to any of the demonstrations that were outside of the university here in Australia and around the world, they're not anti-Semitic. They're anti-war and anti the slaughter of the people in Gaza at the moment.
As Jim just mentioned, there are protests that are led by Jewish students.
That's exactly right.
I saw in Germany, which is kind of funny, but I saw German police arresting Jewish protesters, which you think, given the history, might be a bit of a sensitive topic. Apparently not.
No.
No.
Look at Germany now calling for war on Russia.
Exactly.
They learnt nothing.
No.
What happened when they had a war in Russia last time?
It's never ended well for them, no. No, of course. But it is, I am quite inspired, I think, by the wide-ranging turnout of these young people in the United States and even in Australia. For people that are watching this possibly from overseas, Australia's a pretty docile little country domestically.
Low population, 25 million people.
Not much really happens. People kind of just get along with their lives and quietly go about things. So for there to still be a continued support for this amongst student groups and continued protest, again, it is inspiring and it's good to see.
And I just would like to say is that you've mentioned previously about social media and the kind of relationship between media and the demonstrations, is that now those students can organise through social media, and the images coming from Gaza are all over people's mobile devices and phones. So what was that like organising without that social media?
That was the big problem.
Yeah.
Well, that goes back to putting the posters on the road, doesn't it? Yeah.
But then what happened when we got the moratoriums, right? Now, I joined the moratorium committee. Lots of us did. They had about, must have been 40 people on the moratorium committee. But you paid money to join. And they had fundraisers. That was another activity that came in with the later demonstration, was fundraising. What did they do with the money? The moratoriums came along and they had a lot of money. They could buy a page in the Advertiser and advertise. Right? Now, you couldn't do that now. But that's the way that the message got out, was that you end up buying advertising space.
No, of course.
All right. One thing before we finish up. Would you have any words for the younger generation out there demonstrating wars, regardless of what they are, but specifically the one going on at the moment?
Well, my first suggestion is, for God's sake, do some homework, read about it. Look, I've come across this attitude where you get people who are getting all upset about what's happening to the Palestinians. But Hamas is a terrorist organisation, right? Israel has a right to exist, okay? But
read some history, understand the conflict.
that's the answer.
Get educated.
Get educated.
You can make up your own mind as well, but at least have a more nuanced understanding.
Yeah.
I
And it's
think.
like I mentioned before, when they draw the parallel between the Palestinians and the Ukrainians.
And and apart from getting organised, reading up, anything else?
I've got plenty, but where do you start?
Yeah.
I think the main thing is, and I've mentioned this a bit earlier, is that develop a strategy where you can get some continuity, right? And that's very difficult.
And also perhaps have concrete goals at the end to achieve.
Well, I think that would be good, but that's very difficult to define.
One thing I'd
No
say,
one knows which way it's going.
but most of the student demonstrations currently do have concrete demands for their universities to not have investments
Oh,
Of course,
yes.
yes,
linked
in
to Israel or to any companies exporting weapons to Israel. So they do have some concrete demands specifically. I've seen some of them.
Yeah.
So,
Whether they will be acted upon, time will tell.
shall see.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Jim. We really appreciate it. Taking the
again-
time to sit down and share your experience and your knowledge.
A veritable fount of knowledge. We are blessed to have you here and share that all with us. And
Yeah, cool.
thank you everyone for watching. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
See you later.